Welcome back to this tutorial. During the last tutorial, we work on how to load CSV files. This is the code that we use. We uploaded a file into Databricks environment. This is the location where the file was uploaded to. This is the file format. So we use this code, this Python code over here to read the file. And after that, we created a table, a permanent table that we named test data, where all the data were saved permanently, just like a SQL database. And you can use that table. You can run a query against the table, and you can do almost anything that you can do against any database. You can use the same query to query the table. Now, I said last week that this is not the optimized way of loading data, because we are beginners, and I want us to know how to start loading data, because when you start in this kind of career, this type of project, you want to start from a simple before you get into complex level. And this is the simplest way for you to load the data. Now imagine if you have a lot of files at this location that you need to load. You're not going to be able to come to this place every time and be changing the file to 1, to file 2, to file 3. You would like to create a notebook that you can dynamically pass the file location to, and that notebook will be able to load the file, get the data into the database for you, which is a Hive in this case, and make the data available for data analysis or for the next process, whether you want to use it for machine learning or the data is going to be used for something different. In that case, in order to make that happen, you want to create a pipeline or your notebook associated that you can pass in a different parameter. And if you're able to pass in parameter, that means you'll be able to pass in a different file name. And this one notebook can be used to load multiple and different type of CSV file. And that is what we're going to work on today. We're going to change this code, make it dynamic, and make it easy for us to load multiple files. Before this class, I created a folder and named it loading files. Inside that folder, I have created 3 different notebooks. One of the notebook is functions. What this is going to do is, when you are loading files, there's going to be a need for you to import different packages. So instead of importing the packages in your notebook, you want to create a separate notebook that will handle only the packages. And there's some parameters that you need to import into your notebook that will optimize something like the delta, because we're going to use delta to do upstart method. That means if there's any changes in your data, you want to update, and if the data is not available, you want to insert, just like a data warehouse concept of slowly changing dimension. But in this case, delta is a very powerful functionality in a Databricks that make this possible for us to be able to do. So in order for all those to work perfectly, these are some of the configuration that we need to set on Spark that improve the performance of that. Now, instead of exporting all those functionality in the same notebook and all your notebook is all looking junky, it's better to separate that from the main notebook. And that is what I did here. So I created a function notebook and I moved all the imports. So all the packages that we need to import, they're going to go into this notebook. And if there's any connection that we need to make to external databases like Azure database or AWS or to a blob, everything will be in this function notebook, because this is going to be like a resource notebook for us that we're going to be putting in all the necessary packages that we need for loading our data. Another folder that we're creating here is putting flat file helper. This is going to be the file that will hold all our codes, right? Like the code that we have here that we're using to load file. No, we have to run this spark.read format to read a file, different file format. So this code is going to go into this to this new notebook. And from this, since this notebook is going to need all the functions that we have in the function notebook, we're going to first import the function, the notebook function that we can use like a command that we can use to import any notebook into another notebook. So this is the name of the function notebook that we created earlier. In order to import all these functions to run it and make them available for this notebook, this code at the top need to be run first. Once you run this code is going to trigger this notebook, and this notebook is going to get run. All these functions and the configuration will be made available on this cluster, and that can be used by any other function or any code that is written in this notebook. Okay. Then the third one is going to be what we call usage. Now, this usage is going to be a place where we're going to call our notebook function. I mean, this load flat file helper, because if you have any multiple files, you pass the file and as a parameter to the code, this code calls this one and this calls your function notebook. And that will make it easy for you to arrange your code in such a way that will be easy for you to maintain it. You can go to this notebook and update any packages that you need for loading your data. You can go into these loading flat files to make changes to the functions or classes that are created to support your data loading. Then you can use this usage notebook to apply, to make use of this code and call them from this place. So let's get started. We're going to go to the notebook. So this is the notebook that we used last week. So I'm going to copy this code here. I'm going to put it in this location. Okay, and before we move forward, let's make sure our cluster is ready. This cluster, okay, this is the one that we used last week. I'm going to start it. And one thing with community notebook is if you don't use your cluster for a long period of time, it's going to get disabled or removed. Then if that happens, you can just go ahead and recreate it. So you can see this currently disabled. But if you're working on Azure or AWS, it takes almost maybe like 90 days or something before your cluster get removed if you're not using it. So let's create a new cluster, just like we did last week. So I'm going to get the latest compute. I'm going to create a new one. So while this is waiting, while this is loading, let's go ahead and get our notebook ready now. So this is what we're going to do here. We're going to change this code and make it dynamic, make it easy for us to pass the parameter. Though we already have all these parameters that are passed to this code, but we want to design it in such a way that we're going to change this to a Python function, and that Python function can be used to load different file types, so that here right now we're passing the CSV. If we pass in a file that is TST or that has the extension of JSON, this same code, we can use it to load it. So that is what we're going to do. So the first step in changing this code into a function is by, let me remove this. No, you create a function. We call it def. Anytime you're creating a function in Python, you start it with D here. We're defining a function. We're going to call this load CSV files. Okay. And colon. Then we need to move this function back so that this is going to be under just under this. Okay. Let me get this straight. Because at times, if you don't have a proper alignment in such a way that will make this work, you're going to be getting error message. So I'm going to move everything back to one line. So this is the first step. So what we're doing here is we're creating a function called load CSV files. And this function, if you call this function is going to execute this code here. And this code is going to ask for each one of these parameters. And this parameter are displayed, they are provided up here. But since we have a notebook that we want to use for a function, so we're going to copy this function to our function notebook. But once we do that, all these parameters, nobody is going to know the parameters, because if you call this function in a different notebook, we might run into issue. So in that case, we're going to bring all our parameters inside this function. So the info schema, the first one, first row in the header. Anybody that been writing Python code gonna be able to do this without any issue. So let me bring this one back here. So let's do this back again so that everything can be able to see all our code. Okay. Now, once we have this function, then what does this function returns? Because we're using this to load our files. Once we get the file, we want to return the df. Then down here under the df, we're going to say return df. So that is going to return our data frame. Then we can now display the data frame. Let me move this to this. You can see we change our code to function. So this function request would need the info schema. The first row, we want to tell this function whether the first row is a header or delimiter, the kind of delimiter, because we can have a pipe delimiter or tab delimiters or comma delimiter for CSV files. And for file type, we can use either JSON or TXT, depends on the type of file that we want to load. Okay, and this is the file location. So one other thing that we're going to do is, because in some cases you might want to provide like a default that, for example, the delimiter, because almost maybe like 60% of CSV files out there, they are comma delimiter. Then we can say by default, can set the default for that, copy this, and say, okay, by default, I want this to be comma. Then later on, if there's any need for us to change it, we can change that. That is the default setting. Then for the file type, we can say, okay, we want this to be CSV. So say equals to CSV. Okay. Then the info schema. Do you want to infer the schema? Yes or no? By default, we can say false. Then we can change it later on if we know that the file does, or if we know that we want to infer the schema. You see, we are now providing each one of these as a default, the default value for all these parameters. Then the next one is the first row. Most of the time, the first row in the CSV is going to be the header. So set this one to true. You can see we've already we're providing each one of this functionality. We're providing them with a default, and we can still use a different format. If we want to change the inverse schema to false or true, we can still do that because this is a function and this is just the default. So now, because when you are arranging these parameters for the definition in Python, if you have a parameter that has the default, then you cannot have the one that doesn't have default at the end of this. So we're going to move this to this location here. Okay, let me remove this comma. Okay, so now this is our function. In order for us to test it, so we are going to provide, this is a file location. This functionality is going to be provided to this, and we can try to load the same file. Let me see if our cluster is ready. Okay, the cluster is ready. So first, we're going to run this notebook to get all the functionality from our function notebook. And just to test, as part of what we have in our function notebook, we have here to get the cluster name, a cluster ID, and the cluster name. So what this is going to do is to give me the name of the cluster that I'm running on, because at times you want to know whether you are running from a production cluster or from a dev cluster or from a dev cluster or from a test cluster. That is going to provide us this information here. So you can see cluster one. This is the cluster one that we're running from. So that means that functionality is being loaded. Now the next step, let's run this. Oh, there's an error. Oh, sorry. This is supposed to be colon. Run this. Now the file is loaded using this function. So if I go to the display there, you see we got the error message. This is because right now I'm able to run my function, but I did not call this function to load this data. Now the function is ready, all these parameters are ready, but we need to first call this function to load the data. Then after that, we can now display it. So at the top here, I'm going to do that. So we can now say df. Okay, this can be anything. So let me make this one df1. Okay, and then we're going to call this function here. This is load CSV. Then this load CSV has parameters. Okay, so we have all these parameters here: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But out of these 5, each one of these that has the default value, we don't need to provide them, because if we don't provide the parameter for this, automatically this code is going to use the default value. But we need to provide the file location. So I'm going to, the file location is what we need to provide here. That is the first part of our parameter. So in that case, we can say the file location, which is what we have there. We can bring it down here. Now, the value of file location, let me bring this to remove it. This is the value of file location. Let's execute this cell. So this value is now loaded into this file location. Then we can now use this function to load this file in this location. Now, this is now calling this function and it's loading our file. As you can see, this is just one line. Instead of having these like 4 or 5 lines, we have everything in one line. So now our data is now loaded into this data frame. Now we can now call the data frame to look at the data. Sorry, this is df1. You can see now we have our data right here, just like we have it last week. In order for us to conform with our format, now we have a notebook that going to handle all our functions. So we're going to move this function into the function notebook. I'm going to copy that, come into the function notebook and paste it right here. So now we can use this function for multiple files. So let's go back to this. Here, we don't need all this no more. I'm going to delete this. As you can see, we now have our notebook very clean. Let me go back here and clear all the cell. So see how clean the notebook is right now. So we have a function here that we can call. This is just to test to make sure that we get the value from our notebook. Now this is the file location that we want to load data from. And we pass that file location into this. So you can pass multiple file location to this and be to this function and be able to load your file. So let's try it again. I'm going to first load a notebook that is successful. Let's test this. We have the cluster. Let's load the file. We have a file location. Then let's load it into the data frame. Then let's load our file. See, now we're able to load our file without any issue. We can use this to load multiple files from multiple locations. Now, there's another thing that we need to look at. Let's assume we have a duplicate in this file. When you load a file, just like anybody that is in a data warehouse field that you've been loading data using an ETL method, you know that at times when you load a CSV file, there might be a lot of duplicate that you want to clean. You want to make sure you clean your data. Maybe the name is not well written. There's a format. Now there are a lot of some standardization that you want to do on your data. You want to make sure that the file is clean. So in that case, what we can do also here is after loading this file, we can look at it to check if there's a duplicate. So the function to get it to remove a duplicate from a file is we have a df. We can now say df underscore the dupe that we want to remove the duplicate equals to this df1 dot drop drop duplicates. Okay, so this function is going to remove any duplicate that we have in this file. As you can see, this file right now has almost 1,000 rows. So if we go ahead and run it again, before that, let's do the row count. The row count here is going to be df1 dot count. Okay, see order. So right now we have 15,723 rows. Now, by the time we load this and run the duplicate, to remove the duplicate, we're going to have a different row count. So down here, let's check the one for without duplicate. So this dot count. Okay, so we're going to run this right now. Now we're loading our df, then we dedupe it. So if I do this, this is now 15,000, but with the one without duplicate, see, 2562. That means we have a lot of duplicate in this file that we're using. And now we're able to clean it with just one code. Now we're able to load the file and we're able to remove the duplicate. This is the kind of steps that you want to include your data loading process. Now, you're going to have to clean the data. You have to standardize it. If the header is wrong, if the data is not well formatted, you want to do all those in your code. And we can even include this functionality in our function. And that function is just going to return everything for us. So let's add this dedupe into our functionality, and that is just going to make everything happen at once before we receive our data. Now, before we return this data, we want to dedupe it. So I'm going to move this under the df. So we want to dedupe this. This is going to df. Then now we're going to return the data without the duplicate. As you can see, now our function is getting to a good place for us. So now we don't need this from here. Now we can now run this and everything is going to happen. Oh, first of all, we have to load our function. Okay, then we can now run this. Now, if I do count before we use our dedupe in our function, this was 15,000. So if I run it now, the row count, see, 2562, no more duplicate, and everything with this just one line of code, because we clean our data and we move everything into a function notebook. As you can see, we can add a lot of functionality. Either we want to rename the column, or we want to clean the column, or if there's any underscore or any space, because CSV file can be really challenging to load. If you are the kind that have done it before, there's going to be a lot of bad characters that you need to remove. You can include all that in your function. You just call this one function and you're going to be able to load your data. Now, before we go today, there's one thing I would like to mention. See right here, right now, we have just one file. Now, let's assume we have multiple files in this location. How are we going to be able to loop in this location and find all the files, any file that has .csv at the end of it, and we'll be able to load it? Okay, so there's this functionality in Databricks. It's called a DB utility that you can use to list all files in a location. So this is a DB utility. You can use this to list all files in a location. So let's get this location down here. Let's run this and see what we're going to get. You can see at this location right now, we have the free test data, right? This is the only file that we have in it. So if we have multiple files, how are we going to loop through them? We're going to say, use a range to get all the files. So the first thing we're going to do is, for I in the range, from starting from the beginning, which is the 0, and the length of these, we can name, pass this parameter here as DLL. Okay, so for any file that we have in this location, okay, let's first print it and see what we're going to get. Print I. Right now we have only just one file, but if we have multiple files, let's see, this is 0 right now because we have file in number 1. That is the first index from this range. So let me remove this file name right now because we don't need that. We don't need that file name. We just want to get everything that is available at this location. So let's do this. See, 0 and 1, but we want to find a specific file. In that case, we want to be able to get the file name. Okay, we want to get the name of the file in that place. We want to pass the parameter of the file name into the DDL here. The first one, which is 0 and 1, all we want here is to get the name. Then we want to get the path. Okay, this is going to make it easy for us to build, to loop through this location, get all the file, name and get all the file path. Now, if we want to look at it, we want to make sure that there's going to be a lot of file in this location. We want to make sure that if the file is not, if the file name does not have this /, then we're going to use that. We can now say our file location now. File, let me use file path instead of location. Our file path is now going to be df. No, we have the file name at the top. Sorry, we have the file path. Okay, then we're going to get the file path. We're going to replace, because there's going to be //dbs in front of it. We're going to replace that with null. So /d, that means database file system. That is the file system for Databricks. We want to replace that with a blank. Okay. Then once we're done with that, then we want to return that file name. I mean the file path. So that file path is what we're going to use. So let's look at what we're going to get. You can see we now have two. We load this way. If you remember at the beginning, we load the first one just to test what the file looked like. Then the second method was when we try to use the Python code. So the two files are there. So if we have multiple files at this location, everything will be listed. Now, all we have to do now is to pass this file into this into our parameter. So instead of file location, we're going to pass the file path. And now we can run this without hard coding anything. The only thing we provide is the location where we have the files. We're looping through the location to get all the files. Then we're passing the files to this CSV. We're removing the duplicate, and we just do the row count. And for us to, we don't need this anymore because we already added this to our function, no more dedupe. Then we can now look at the data to make sure that our data is still the same thing. So I'm going to run everything at once. First, clean the cell. Then I'm going to run everything. Run all. It's going to go ahead and run everything for us. Remember, see? Now all these two files are now loaded. You can see the row count is 2562, 2562. All the duplicate has been removed, and we now have our data. You can see how we're improving the code. Now that code now make it easy for us to get everything we need. Now we can turn this to a function also. We turn it to a function and return only the file path. Let's quickly do that. So in this case, we're going to now have define file path. Okay. And what do we need to pass into this? We just pass in the file path. Okay. With colon. Going to move this one back. Just a tab. This lower one. Just a tab. Okay. Now we have this. Then we're going to return the file path. So return file path. Okay. This is going to return the file path for us. Then we can copy. Let's test this to be sure it's perfect. So let's copy this. Let's copy this. Into our function. So we have all our functions here. Then we can get this function to our main notebook. And we can call this before Then let's delete this, have it in our function. Okay. So as you can see, we only have how many lines? We don't need to do row count. Can bring the row count to the row count so that we can be sure there is no more duplicate. So I'm getting rid of this. Okay, so let's run. So you're gonna get everything the same way. So run all. Uh-oh, we have an error. Oh yeah, I forgot to provide this. Okay, let's run everything again. Uh-oh, we have another error. Oh, sorry. So this is a function we're using to call the file path. Let me call this fp. Push that into that. Then we're going to use fp here. Okay. So that means we're loading the file path to this. That we're using this parameter. This variable inside load CSV file function, and now we can get the count from there. Let me first clean everything. See. We run this. You can see now everything runs perfectly. We have our data. See, with a clean code. And that is the reason why I want us to arrange our file, separate the code, separate your functions, and call everything as needed. Right now, you see how clean our notebook is. We can look at these three codes and say, okay, this is what we're going to need to load our functions. To load our file. And no matter the number of files that we have in this location, we'll be able to load all of them and remove the duplicate. Now, in our next class, we're going to use Delta. This is the functionality in Python, in a Databricks, and that is being used by Spark to like the dupe. If you want to do the offset, we can load multiple files into a table and automatically, if the data is in there, we can update it, or we can do insert. We call it offset. So we're going to do that to mirror like slow changing dimension in SQL Server for data warehouse as you know it. So that is going to be what we're going to do in the next class, and we're going to improve on this code. And after that, we're going to have a notebook that we can use to load a flat file from beginning to the end without having any issue. Thank you very much for your time.